The champagne fountain sparkled under crystal chandeliers as 300 guests watched my sister walk to the microphone during the reception toasts. Her emerald dress caught the light as she steadied herself against the podium, one hand pressed dramatically against her stomach. I should have known something was wrong when she insisted on speaking before the maid of honor. I should have recognized the calculated gleam in her eyes as identical to the one she'd worn when she told our parents I'd stolen her college acceptance letter 14 years ago. A lie that took me 6 months to disprove. But I was too happy, too caught up in the joy of marrying Marcus, to see the sabotage coming until her voice cut through the celebration like a serrated knife. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I'm so sorry to do this now, Danielle said into the microphone, her voice trembling with practiced emotion. But I can't let this wedding continue without telling the truth. Marcus got me pregnant 3 months ago, and he promised he'd leave Victoria for me. The ballroom of Magnolia Gardens Estate fell into a silence so complete I could hear my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. 300 faces turned toward me in synchronized shock. My wedding dress suddenly felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Marcus stood frozen beside me, his face drained of all color, his champagne flute tilting dangerously in his hand. This was supposed to be the happiest day of my life. I'd spent 18 months planning every detail, from the hand-calligraphed invitations to the vintage roses cascading down the ceremony arbor. The late spring sunshine had cooperated perfectly, filtering through the ancient oak trees exactly as I'd imagined. Everything had been flawless until this moment. Danielle's hand moved to her abdomen in a gesture so theatrical it would have been laughable if it wasn't destroying my wedding. Tears streamed down her face, and I had to admit she'd perfected her performance. Our mother stood up from the family table so abruptly her chair crashed backward onto the parquet floor. Patricia Hayes was not a woman who tolerated drama, especially not the kind that disrupted carefully orchestrated social events. She'd spent 40 years building her reputation in Charleston society, and her eldest daughter's wedding at the most prestigious venue in the city was supposed to be her crowning achievement. Instead, my sister had just turned it into the scandal of the season. But my mother didn't rush to comfort Danielle or demand explanations from Marcus. She walked slowly toward the microphone with the kind of deliberate calm that made my blood run cold. I'd seen that walk before, usually right before she dismantled someone's argument with surgical precision at her law firm. She reached into her clutch purse and pulled out a slim envelope, cream-colored with my sister's name written across the front in my mother's distinctive handwriting. She held it up for everyone to see, then placed it on the podium in front of Danielle with the gentleness of someone setting down a live grenade. "Open it," my mother said quietly into the microphone. Her voice carried through the sound system with crystalline clarity. "Since you've decided to make announcements in front of 300 witnesses, let's make sure everyone hears the complete truth." The morning of my wedding had started at 5:30 with Lauren shaking me awake in the bridal suite at Magnolia Gardens. The room smelled like gardenias and expensive hairspray, exactly the way I'd imagined it would when I'd booked this venue 2 years ago. Sunlight was just beginning to filter through the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the formal gardens where Marcus and I would exchange vows in exactly 7 hours. Everything was running on schedule. My dress hung on a custom padded hanger near the window, the ivory silk catching the early light and making it look like something from a fairy tale. The bodice was covered in hand-sewn pearls that my grandmother had spent 3 months attaching, each one placed with the kind of meticulous care that came from genuine love. Lauren handed me coffee in the porcelain cup I'd specifically requested, the one with delicate pink roses that matched my grandmother's china pattern. She'd been my best friend since we were 7 years old, bonding over our shared hatred of jump rope in elementary school PE class. Now she was a pediatric surgeon at Palmetto Medical Center, but this weekend she'd taken off to focus entirely on making sure my wedding was perfect. She'd already fielded 17 questions from the florist, mediated a dispute between my mother and the wedding planner about the centerpiece height, and somehow managed to hide my phone so I wouldn't stress over last-minute vendor confirmations. "Your sister just texted," Lauren said carefully, watching my face for a reaction. "She wants to know if she can say something during the toasts." I felt my stomach tighten the way it always did when Danielle was involved in my major life events. My younger sister by 3 years had a gift for making everything about her, a talent she'd honed since childhood when she dramatically fainted at my 8th grade graduation to steal attention from my valedictorian speech. At my college graduation, she'd announced her engagement to a boyfriend no one knew existed. The engagement lasted exactly 2 weeks before she admitted she'd made it up to have something exciting to talk about at my celebration dinner. "Tell her the toasts are already planned," I said, sipping my coffee and trying to keep my voice neutral. "Maid of honor, best man, and parents only." Lauren typed rapidly on her phone, then frowned at the response. "She says she has something important to share. Something about you and Marcus that everyone should know before the ceremony." The coffee suddenly tasted bitter in my mouth. This was classic Danielle, creating drama and dangling vague threats to ensure she got what she wanted. But today was my wedding day, and I was determined not to let her manipulate me into another confrontation that would end with me looking like the unreasonable older sister who couldn't share the spotlight. "She can share it privately after the wedding," I said firmly. "This is not negotiable." What I didn't know then was that Danielle had no intention of waiting. She'd already made plans that would detonate in the middle of my reception, carefully timed for maximum impact. But in that moment, sitting in the bridal suite with morning light painting everything gold, I was still blissfully unaware of how thoroughly she intended to destroy the day I'd spent 2 years planning. The ceremony itself was everything I'd dreamed about. Marcus stood at the altar in his charcoal gray suit, looking at me like I was the only person in the world as I walked down the aisle on my father's arm. Gregory Hayes squeezed my hand gently before placing it in Marcus's, a gesture that carried all the love and support he'd shown me throughout my 32 years. The officiant spoke about partnership and commitment while oak trees rustled overhead and the scent of roses filled the warm afternoon air. When Marcus slipped the platinum band onto my finger, his hands were steady and sure, his eyes slightly damp with emotion he didn't bother hiding. "I promise to choose you every single day," he said during his vows, his voice clear and strong. "In the easy moments and the difficult ones, in the mundane and the extraordinary, you will always be my first choice, my best decision, my greatest adventure." I'd written my own vows on cream-colored cards that I'd tucked into my bouquet, words I'd agonized over for weeks trying to capture what Marcus meant to me. We'd met 3 years ago at a hospital fundraiser where I'd been coordinating the silent auction for the children's wing expansion. Marcus was a structural engineer who donated his time to consult on the building project, and he'd spent 20 minutes explaining load-bearing walls and foundation requirements with such genuine enthusiasm that I'd fallen a little bit in love with him right there between the auction tables. He made me laugh in ways I hadn't since college. He remembered small details like how I preferred my coffee and which true crime podcasts I was currently obsessed with. He got along seamlessly with my parents and even managed to charm my difficult Aunt Carol, who notoriously hated everyone. "You make ordinary days feel like adventures," I said, reading from my carefully prepared cards. "You turn my anxious thoughts into laughter and my doubts into confidence. I promise to be your partner in every sense of the word, to build a life with you that honors both who we are individually and who we become together." When the officiant pronounced us married and Marcus kissed me, 300 guests erupted in applause. Lauren dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief while my father cleared his throat repeatedly, his own version of managing emotion. My mother's smile was radiant with satisfaction, the kind that came from executing a flawless event. Even Danielle was clapping from her seat in the 3rd row, though I noticed she was checking her phone instead of watching as Marcus and I walked back down the aisle as husband and wife. The cocktail hour flowed smoothly into the reception. Monica Pierce, our wedding planner, had outdone herself transforming the ballroom into something magical. Thousands of tiny lights hung from the ceiling like stars, and the centerpieces combined vintage roses with eucalyptus branches in a way that felt both elegant and natural. The band played jazz standards while servers circulated with champagne and hors d'oeuvres. Marcus kept his hand on the small of my back as we moved through the crowd, greeting guests and accepting congratulations. His mother Helen pulled me aside to tell me I looked beautiful and that she was thrilled to officially call me her daughter. Ryan, Marcus's best man and college roommate, made a joke about finally getting Marcus to commit to something besides his engineering projects. Everything was perfect until dinner service began and I noticed Danielle whispering intensely with Monica near the entrance to the kitchen. My sister caught me watching and smiled, the kind of smile that sent alarm bells ringing through my nervous system. I'd seen that smile before, usually right before she did something calculated to cause maximum chaos. But Marcus squeezed my hand and pulled my attention back to our table, where his grandmother was telling an embarrassing story about him as a child, and I pushed my unease aside. The toasts were scheduled to begin after the main course. Lauren would speak first, followed by Ryan, then our parents. I'd specifically organized it this way to maintain a natural flow and keep the speeches relatively brief. Charleston society weddings had a reputation for dragging on too long, and I wanted our guests to actually enjoy themselves rather than enduring hours of speeches from distant relatives who barely knew us. But as the servers cleared the dinner plates, Danielle stood up from her table and walked toward the microphone before Lauren could reach it. She moved with purpose, her emerald dress swishing around her legs, one hand pressed against her stomach in a gesture I initially thought was nervousness. Monica tried to intercept her, probably to redirect her back to the planned schedule, but Danielle simply stepped around her with the kind of determination that suggested she had no intention of being deterred. "Excuse me," Danielle said, tapping the microphone to get everyone's attention. The band stopped playing mid-song. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Conversations died mid-sentence. 300 faces turned expectantly toward my sister, assuming she was about to deliver a sweet tribute to the bride and groom. I felt Marcus tense beside me, his hand finding mine under the table and gripping it tightly. "I know I'm not on the official toast schedule," Danielle continued, her voice taking on a trembling quality that I recognized as completely manufactured. She was setting a scene, building towards something. "But there's something I need to say before this night goes any further. Something I should have said months ago." My mother's face had gone very still, the kind of stillness that meant she was rapidly calculating angles and consequences. My father leaned forward in his seat, his expression shifting from confusion to concern. Lauren was frozen halfway out of her chair, looking between Danielle and me with growing alarm. "Victoria," Danielle said, turning to look directly at me with eyes that glistened with tears. Real tears or fake ones, I couldn't tell anymore. She'd always been an exceptional actress. "You're my sister and I love you, but I can't let you marry this man without knowing the truth." The ballroom had achieved that peculiar quality of silence where even breathing seemed too loud. Every eye was locked on Danielle as she stood at the microphone, one hand still pressed dramatically against her stomach. I watched her take a deep breath, watched her shoulders rise and fall, watched her mouth open to deliver whatever bomb she'd been planning. "Marcus got me pregnant," she said, her voice breaking on the last word. 3 months ago. We've been having an affair since January, and he promised me he would call off the wedding. He said he loved me, that he'd made a mistake getting engaged to you, that we could be a family together." The words hit the room like a physical force. I heard someone gasp, heard the scrape of chairs as people shifted to get a better view of the drama unfolding. Marcus's hand released mine as he stood up abruptly, his chair crashing backward. "That's absolutely insane," Marcus said, his voice carrying across the silent ballroom. "Danielle, what are you talking about? We've never even been alone together." But Danielle was ready for his denial. She pulled her phone from somewhere in her dress and held it up. "I have text messages," she said, her voice stronger now, more confident. "Proof of everything. Hotel receipts, photos, everything." My mother stood up then, moving with that deliberate calm that I'd seen her use in courtrooms when she was about to demolish an opponent's case. She walked toward the microphone, and something in her posture made Danielle's confident expression falter slightly. Patricia Hayes was 58 years old, silver-haired, impeccably dressed in champagne-colored silk, and absolutely terrifying when crossed. She'd built her career as one of Charleston's most respected family law attorneys by being smarter, more prepared, and more ruthless than everyone else in the room. She reached into her clutch and pulled out the cream-colored envelope, placing it on the podium with careful precision. The entire ballroom held its collective breath, waiting to see what would happen next. I sat frozen at the head table, my wedding dress suddenly feeling like a costume for a play I hadn't auditioned for, watching my mother prepare to either save or destroy what remained of my wedding day. "Open it," my mother said into the microphone, her voice level and clear. Since you've decided to make accusations in front of 300 people, let's make absolutely certain everyone knows the complete truth. Danielle's fingers trembled as she reached for the envelope, though whether from genuine fear or continued performance I couldn't determine. The paper made a soft tearing sound that seemed impossibly loud in the hushed ballroom. She pulled out what looked like several printed pages, her eyes scanning the first sheet with growing confusion that shifted rapidly into something resembling panic. The color drained from her face in a way that couldn't be faked, not even by someone as practiced in deception as my sister. My mother didn't move from her position beside the podium, standing with the kind of stillness that reminded me of a predator waiting for exactly the right moment to strike. Her expression remained neutral, almost pleasant, as if she were simply waiting for Danielle to finish reading a particularly interesting restaurant menu rather than evidence that would either validate or destroy the accusation she'd just made against my husband. "Those are the results of a paternity test," my mother said calmly into the microphone. Her voice carried through the sound system with perfect clarity, reaching every corner of the ballroom where 300 guests sat in stunned silence. "Conducted last week at Palmetto Medical Center. The child you claim Marcus fathered isn't his. In fact, the test confirms the father is actually Tyler Brennan, Marcus's younger brother, who you've been seeing secretly for the past 6 months." The gasps that rippled through the crowd were audible this time, a wave of shock that seemed to physically move through the assembled guests. I felt my own breath catch in my throat as I processed what my mother had just revealed. Tyler Brennan was Marcus's brother by 2 years, currently living in Atlanta where he worked in pharmaceutical sales. He'd been at the wedding, seated somewhere toward the back with extended family members. I'd met him perhaps 5 times over the 3 years Marcus and I had been together, brief encounters at family gatherings where Tyler had always seemed charming but slightly distant, as if he were perpetually thinking about somewhere else he'd rather be. Danielle's hands were shaking badly enough now that the papers rustled audibly. She looked up from the documents, her eyes wild and searching for an escape route that didn't exist. Every exit from the ballroom required walking past tables full of witnesses, all of whom were now staring at her with expressions ranging from shock to disgust to barely concealed fascination at watching a spectacular public implosion. "I don't understand," Danielle stammered, her carefully rehearsed speech completely abandoned. "How did you even get this? You had no right to test my baby without my permission." My mother's smile was thin and cold, the expression she wore when opposing counsel walked directly into a trap she'd spent weeks setting. "You gave permission yourself, actually. Remember that health clinic visit last month when you thought you were participating in a routine prenatal study? The consent forms you signed included authorization for genetic testing. All completely legal and above board, which I made certain of before proceeding. I am an attorney, after all." The implications were staggering. My mother had known about Danielle's pregnancy for at least a month, possibly longer. She'd arranged for paternity testing without anyone's knowledge, collected evidence, and waited. The envelope had been in her possession throughout the entire ceremony, through cocktail hour and dinner service, ready to deploy at precisely the moment it would be most effective. She'd let Danielle walk to that microphone and make her accusation, allowed her to commit fully to the lie in front of hundreds of witnesses, before producing proof that would demolish her credibility completely. Marcus had moved to stand beside me, his hand finding my shoulder in a gesture of solidarity and support. His face showed a mixture of relief and anger, the kind of expression that comes from being falsely accused of something terrible and then vindicated in the most dramatic way possible. I could see Helen Brennan across the ballroom, her face pale with shock as she processed the revelation about her younger son. Ryan was already pulling out his phone, presumably to start tracking down Tyler, who I now noticed was conspicuously absent from his assigned seat. "There's more," my mother continued, pulling additional papers from her clutch with the practiced ease of someone who'd prepared for exactly this moment. "Text messages between you and Tyler, downloaded from phone records that he voluntarily provided once confronted with the pregnancy. Messages where you discuss your plan to break up Victoria and Marcus, where you talk about convincing Tyler to help you by creating supposed evidence of an affair. Messages where Tyler refuses to continue with your scheme and tells you he wants nothing to do with either you or the child." Danielle was crying now, but these tears lacked the theatrical quality of her earlier performance. These were messy, desperate tears accompanied by hitching breaths and a running nose that she tried futilely to wipe with the back of her hand. Lauren appeared beside her with tissues, though whether from kindness or simply to move things along I couldn't tell. My best friend's face showed no sympathy, only the clinical detachment she used at the hospital when dealing with difficult parents who made bad decisions that affected their children. "The hotel receipts you mentioned are real," my mother said, her voice never losing its measured calm. "But they're from your encounters with Tyler, not Marcus. The photos you claim to have are digitally altered, badly I might add, which any forensic analysis would reveal in minutes. The pregnancy is real, but the father is Tyler Brennan, who wants nothing to do with you after discovering your plan to frame his brother." Did I miss anything? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Danielle stood at the podium clutching the paternity results, her emerald dress no longer looking elegant but somehow cheap under the ballroom's crystal chandeliers. She opened her mouth as if to protest, to offer some explanation or justification, but no words came out. What possible response existed to such comprehensive dismantling of her fabricated narrative? My father had moved to stand beside my mother, presenting a united front that they'd maintained throughout 40 years of marriage. Gregory Hayes looked at his younger daughter with an expression I'd never seen him wear before, a combination of disappointment so profound it bordered on grief. He'd always had a soft spot for Danielle, making excuses for her dramatic tendencies and attention-seeking behavior as harmless quirks that she'd grow out of eventually. Watching him realize that she'd evolved from seeking attention to actively trying to destroy her sister's wedding seemed to age him a decade in the span of seconds. "Pack your belongings from the estate," my father said quietly, but his voice still carried through the microphone my mother held. "You're no longer welcome in our home. We'll arrange to have anything you leave behind shipped to wherever you decide to go, but you need to leave now." The finality in his voice left no room for negotiation. Danielle looked desperately around the ballroom as if searching for an ally, someone who might defend her or at least offer sympathy. But 300 guests looked back at her with expressions ranging from disgust to pity to the kind of morbid fascination people show at traffic accidents. She'd miscalculated catastrophically, assuming she could manipulate the situation through shock value and manufactured evidence, never considering that my mother might have been investigating her claims from the moment rumors first surfaced. Monica Pierce appeared at Danielle's elbow, gently but firmly guiding her away from the microphone and toward the ballroom's side exit. The wedding planner's face maintained professional neutrality, though I suspected she was mentally composing the story she'd tell at future industry events about the most dramatic wedding disaster she'd ever witnessed. Danielle went with her without resistance, moving like a sleepwalker through the silent crowd. The doors closed behind them with a soft click that seemed to release the tension holding the entire room hostage. My mother handed the microphone to Lauren with a small nod, then returned to her seat beside my father as if nothing unusual had occurred. The band, receiving some signal from Monica through their earpieces, launched into an upbeat jazz number that felt wildly inappropriate given what had just transpired but at least broke the oppressive silence. Conversations resumed gradually, hundreds of simultaneous whispers as guests processed what they'd witnessed and began crafting the versions they'd tell friends and family who hadn't been present. Lauren stepped up to the microphone with her prepared toast, though she wisely abandoned her original opening joke about never betting against Victoria and Marcus's relationship surviving anything. Instead, she spoke honestly about watching me navigate difficult family dynamics with grace, about the strength it took to maintain boundaries while still trying to love people who didn't always deserve it, about how Marcus had proven himself worthy by standing beside me through challenges she couldn't detail but that we'd weathered together. The rest of the evening proceeded with surreal normalcy. Ryan gave his best man speech focusing on Marcus's loyalty and integrity, shooting pointed looks toward the exit Danielle had used. My parents offered brief remarks about the joy of seeing their daughter marry someone who genuinely cherished her, carefully avoiding any mention of the daughter who'd just been escorted from the premises. The cake was cut, the first dance completed, the bouquet tossed to a squealing group of single women who probably attended hoping for romance but definitely hadn't expected this much drama. Marcus and I moved through the remainder of our reception in a strange bubble of shock and relief. Guests approached us with congratulations that now carried undertones of sympathy and morbid curiosity. Several people asked if we'd known about Danielle's planned disruption, seeming almost disappointed when we confirmed it had been a complete surprise. Helen Brennan apologized profusely for Tyler's role in the scheme, tears streaming down her face as she tried to explain that she'd had no idea her younger son was capable of such betrayal. Marcus hugged his mother and assured her that he didn't blame her for his brother's choices, though his jaw remained tight with anger that I knew would take time to fully process. When we finally left the reception at midnight, climbing into the vintage Rolls-Royce that would take us to the Harbor Hotel where we'd spend our wedding night before flying to Santorini in the morning, I felt simultaneously exhausted and wired with adrenaline. The drive through Charleston's historic district provided a buffer of quiet, the street lamps casting pools of warm light on cobblestone streets while tourists wandered past restaurant patios and bars spilling music into the humid night air. "I can't believe your mother just had all that ready," Marcus said finally, breaking the silence that had stretched between us since we'd waved goodbye to the last departing guests. "The paternity test, the phone records, everything. How long do you think she'd been investigating?" I leaned my head against his shoulder, careful not to disturb the remnants of my updo that had somehow survived the entire chaotic evening. Knowing my mother? Probably from the first moment she heard any rumor about Danielle's pregnancy. She doesn't leave things to chance, especially not when it comes to protecting her family's reputation. Though I suspect in this case it was more about protecting me specifically than worrying about social standing. The hotel suite was filled with flowers and champagne, courtesy of Monica, who'd somehow found time to ensure the romantic touches were in place despite managing the evening's spectacular crisis. Marcus loosened his tie and collapsed onto the sofa while I stood at the window looking out at the harbor where boats rocked gently in their slips, their masts creating a forest of vertical lines against the night sky. "We should probably talk about what happens next," I said quietly, still processing everything that had occurred. "With your brother, with my sister, with how we navigate family events going forward." Marcus came to stand behind me, his arms wrapping around my waist and pulling me back against his chest. "Tomorrow," he said firmly. "Tonight was supposed to be about celebrating us, and despite your sister's best efforts to destroy that, we're still married. Still choosing each other. The rest of it can wait until we're not both running on adrenaline and wedding cake." He was right, though I knew sleep would be elusive with my mind racing through the evening's revelations. How long had my mother known about Danielle's scheme? Had she suspected from the beginning that Tyler was involved, or had that discovery come during her investigation? What had prompted Tyler to cooperate with her by providing phone records and consenting to the paternity test? And perhaps most pressingly, where was Danielle now and what would she do next? The next morning brought text messages from Lauren checking if we were okay and informing me that the wedding had become the talk of Charleston society within hours of ending. Apparently several guests had social media accounts with substantial followings, and while they'd been discreet enough not to name names or post identifying photos, the basic story of a dramatic wedding disruption and spectacular maternal intervention had spread through interconnected social circles like wildfire. My phone showed 17 missed calls from numbers I didn't recognize, presumably reporters or gossip columnists hoping to get details for their publications. Marcus and I made a mutual decision to ignore all outside communication until after our honeymoon, setting our phones to airplane mode and focusing solely on the week ahead in Greece. The flight to Santorini provided hours of uninterrupted time to decompress and discuss everything that had happened. Marcus admitted that Tyler had always been somewhat competitive with him, but he'd never imagined his brother would participate in something so deliberately cruel. I confessed that while Danielle's attention-seeking behavior had been escalating for years, I'd never truly believed she'd go to such extreme lengths to disrupt my happiness. Santorini itself was a welcome escape from reality, all whitewashed buildings and blue-domed churches perched on cliffs overlooking impossibly azure water. We spent days exploring winding streets in hilltop villages, eating fresh seafood at tavernas with views that seemed designed for romance, swimming in the Aegean and letting the salt water wash away some of the stress that had accumulated in the months of wedding planning and the trauma of the reception disruption. At night we'd sit on our hotel balcony drinking local wine and talking about our future in ways that felt more honest now that we'd survived a test neither of us had anticipated. "I keep thinking about what my mother said," I mentioned one evening as we watched the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. "About how she'd been investigating Danielle's claims. It makes me wonder what else she knows about our family dynamics that she's never shared. What other problems she's been quietly managing without telling us." Marcus swirled wine in his glass, considering. "Your mother is protective in ways that aren't always comfortable to think about. But in this case, her intervention saved us from having that accusation hang over our marriage indefinitely. Can you imagine if Danielle had made those claims and there'd been no immediate way to disprove them? The rumors alone would have poisoned everything. He was absolutely right. Without the paternity test results and phone records, we would have spent months or possibly years under a cloud of suspicion, with people wondering if perhaps there was some truth to Danielle's story. Family gatherings would have been impossible. Friends would have taken sides. The foundation of our marriage would have been constantly questioned. My mother's ruthless preparation and perfect timing had prevented all of that, even if her methods raised questions about privacy and the extent to which she'd been monitoring Danielle's activities. We returned to Charleston a week later, tanned and relaxed, ready to face whatever consequences had developed in our absence. The first surprise came when we pulled up to our townhouse in the Riverside district and found Lauren waiting on our front steps with coffee and pastries from our favorite bakery. "Welcome home, newlyweds," she said, handing us the coffee and following us inside. "I volunteered to be your buffer between vacation bubble and reality. Fair warning, reality is fairly intense right now." She'd brought printed copies of social media posts and news articles that had circulated during our absence. While none named us directly, anyone familiar with Charleston society would recognize the details. Several articles speculated about the identity of the bride whose sister had disrupted her wedding with false pregnancy accusations. One particularly gossipy blog had somehow obtained information about Tyler's involvement, though they'd gotten several details wrong in ways that actually made the story more salacious than reality. "Your mother has been giving no comment to everyone who asks," Lauren continued, settling onto our sofa with her own coffee. "Your father released one statement through his firm saying that private family matters should remain private and requesting that media respect your privacy. Danielle has apparently left Charleston entirely. Last anyone heard, she was heading to Florida, though no one knows exactly where." Marcus and I exchanged glances, processing this information. Part of me felt relief that Danielle had left town, removing the immediate awkwardness of potentially running into her at restaurants or events. Another part worried about her well-being despite everything she'd done. She was still my sister, still carrying a child who would be my niece or nephew regardless of the circumstances of conception or the identity of the father. "What about Tyler?" Marcus asked, his voice carefully neutral, though I could hear the underlying tension. He'd been avoiding thinking about his brother during our honeymoon, pushing aside the hurt and betrayal to focus on our marriage, but now reality demanded attention. Lauren's expression became more serious. "He's still in Atlanta as far as I know. Your mother called him the day after the wedding. I don't know what was said, but apparently he's agreed to take financial responsibility for the child once it's born. He's also apparently been cut off from family money until he proves he can act like an adult." Direct quote from Helen. "Your parents are devastated but trying to be supportive of both you and him, which seems impossible given the circumstances." The next few weeks brought a steady stream of challenges as we navigated reintegrating into normal life while dealing with the aftermath of our wedding disaster. Several of Marcus's extended family members reached out with apologies for Tyler's behavior, as if they somehow bore responsibility for his choices. My own extended family split into camps, with some relatives maintaining that Danielle must have been manipulated or confused, while others argued she'd shown her true character and deserved whatever consequences followed. The truth about how my mother discovered Danielle's scheme emerged gradually over the following months, revealed in pieces during Sunday dinners at my parents' estate in Somerville. Patricia Hayes wasn't one to boast about her strategic victories, but she also believed in teaching through example, and apparently she decided that the full story of her investigation would serve as an important lesson about vigilance and preparation. It had started in January, 4 months before the wedding, when Carol Donovan called my mother after running into Danielle at a downtown coffee shop. Carol was a longtime family friend who'd known both my sister and me since we were children, the kind of woman who noticed everything and forgot nothing. She'd observed Danielle meeting with a man who looked remarkably similar to Marcus, enough so that Carol had initially assumed it was my fiancé until she got close enough to realize the man was younger and their interaction seemed far too intimate for a future brother-in-law greeting his fiancé's sister. My mother had filed this information away without immediately acting on it, but she'd started paying closer attention to Danielle's social media activity and general behavior at family gatherings. She noticed how my sister had become increasingly interested in details about Marcus's work schedule, asking pointed questions about his travel plans and late evenings at the office. When Danielle volunteered to help with wedding planning despite never having shown interest in such things before, my mother's suspicions deepened. The breakthrough came in March when my mother's legal secretary mentioned overhearing Danielle on the phone in the courthouse parking garage. The secretary, a sharp woman named Rita who'd worked with my mother for 15 years, recognized Danielle from family photos displayed in my mother's office. She'd been walking to her car when she heard someone crying in the stairwell, and upon investigating to make sure the person wasn't in danger, she'd found Danielle arguing with someone on speakerphone. The male voice was pleading with her to be reasonable, saying he couldn't go through with whatever plan she'd concocted, that it would destroy his family and he couldn't live with that guilt. Rita hadn't intended to eavesdrop, but Danielle's response made it impossible not to pay attention. My sister had said something about how the man owed her this after getting her pregnant, that she'd only agreed to their affair because he promised to help her get what she deserved, and that if he backed out now she'd make sure everyone knew he was the father of her child. The man had responded that paternity tests existed and the truth would come out eventually, to which Danielle had laughed and said she'd deal with that problem when it arose, but for now she just needed him to provide enough evidence to cast doubt on his brother's character. Rita had immediately recognized the implications and reported the conversation to my mother the next morning. Patricia Hayes had spent that entire day canceling meetings and court appearances to begin what would become a 3-month investigation into her youngest daughter's activities. She'd hired a private investigator, a retired police detective named Frank Morrison who specialized in domestic cases and had a reputation for discretion. Frank's initial findings confirmed that Danielle was indeed pregnant, approximately 6 weeks along based on social media posts she'd made about feeling nauseous and doctor's appointments she'd checked into at various medical facilities. Tracking down the father had proven more complicated. Danielle had been careful to avoid being photographed with Tyler in public, and their text messages used enough coded language that proving the nature of their relationship required substantial context and corroboration. Frank had eventually obtained surveillance footage from a hotel in downtown Charleston showing Danielle and Tyler checking in together on 3 separate occasions in January and February. He'd also managed to interview a bartender at a restaurant near Tyler's Atlanta apartment who remembered seeing them together multiple times, always acting like a couple despite the woman occasionally mentioning she had to get back to Charleston before her family noticed she was gone. My mother had confronted Tyler in early April, flying to Atlanta unannounced and appearing at his pharmaceutical company's office building at the end of his workday. She'd told him she knew about the affair with Danielle and the pregnancy, that she had evidence of their relationship, and that he had exactly one opportunity to come clean about the entire situation including whatever scheme Danielle had convinced him to participate in. Tyler had apparently crumbled immediately, terrified of both his own mother's reaction and the professional consequences of being exposed as someone willing to frame his brother for infidelity. He'd explained the entire sordid affair during a 3-hour conversation at a coffee shop near his office. He and Danielle had met at our engagement party 2 years earlier, and while nothing had happened then, they'd stayed in occasional contact through social media. The relationship had turned romantic during the previous Christmas when Tyler visited Charleston for the holidays. Danielle had apparently been obsessed with the attention and resources Marcus received as the firstborn son, the pride my parents showed in his successful engineering career, and the way family gatherings centered around his achievements and milestones. She'd convinced Tyler that they were both overshadowed by their older siblings, that Marcus had gotten everything easily while Tyler had to fight for scraps of recognition and approval. She'd painted a picture of them as fellow victims of birth order dynamics, suggesting they deserved to take what should have been theirs all along. The plan, as Danielle had outlined it, was to create enough doubt about Marcus's fidelity that I would call off the wedding. Once Marcus and I broke up, she'd intended to comfort me as the supportive sister, eventually suggesting I deserved someone better, perhaps someone more spontaneous and fun like Tyler. The pregnancy hadn't been part of the original plan. Danielle had apparently believed she couldn't conceive after a medical issue in her early 20s, so she and Tyler hadn't been particularly careful. When she discovered she was pregnant in late February, she'd initially panicked but then decided the baby actually enhanced her scheme. She could claim Marcus was the father, create a scandal that would destroy both his reputation and our relationship, and in the aftermath position herself as the wronged party who'd been seduced and abandoned. Tyler would eventually reveal himself as the true father after an appropriate amount of time had passed, at which point Danielle believed I'd be grateful to have dodged marriage to someone so terrible and possibly even approve of her relationship with Tyler. The whole plan was delusional in its complexity and its misunderstanding of how people actually responded to betrayal and manipulation. But Danielle had apparently convinced herself it would work, that she was clever enough to orchestrate this elaborate deception and come out looking sympathetic rather than sociopathic. Tyler had agreed to participate initially, caught up in Danielle's vision and his own resentment toward Marcus, but as the wedding date approached and the reality of what they were planning to do settled in, his conscience had begun troubling him. My mother had made Tyler an offer during that Atlanta coffee shop conversation. He would immediately cease all contact with Danielle, provide written statements detailing the entire affair and scheme, submit to a paternity test once the baby was born, and accept full financial responsibility for the child. In exchange, my mother would not share the information with his employer or make it public in ways that would destroy his career. She would also advocate with his parents for eventual forgiveness, though she made clear that would depend entirely on his cooperation and his commitment to making amends. Tyler had agreed to everything, apparently relieved to have a way out of the situation that didn't involve complete destruction of his life. He'd provided his phone with all his text message exchanges with Danielle intact. He'd written a detailed statement explaining the entire affair from his perspective, including specific dates and locations that could be verified through credit card records and surveillance footage. He'd even agreed to participate in a paternity test before the baby was born using one of the newer non-invasive methods that required only a blood sample from the mother. Getting Danielle to provide that blood sample had required the kind of strategic thinking that made my mother so effective in her legal career. She'd researched prenatal studies being conducted at Palmetto Medical Center and identified one that Danielle would find appealing because it offered free genetic screening for various conditions. My mother had then arranged for Danielle to receive information about the study through a friend who worked in the hospital's obstetrics department, making it seem like a standard recruitment effort rather than a targeted operation. Danielle had enrolled in the study in late April, signing consent forms that included authorization for genetic testing and research use of her biological samples. The forms had been carefully worded by lawyers my mother consulted to ensure everything was completely legal. The prenatal paternity test had been conducted under the guise of the study's genetic screening, with results provided to my mother as the person who'd arranged and paid for the testing. The results had confirmed Tyler's paternity within a statistical certainty of 99.9%. My mother had kept all of this information completely confidential, not even telling my father until a week before the wedding when she decided he needed to know what might be coming. She'd prepared the envelope with printed copies of the paternity test results, Tyler's statement, and selected text messages that proved the affair and the scheme. She'd carried that envelope to the wedding in her clutch, ready to deploy if needed but hoping until the last moment that perhaps Danielle would reconsider her plan. When my sister had walked to the microphone during the reception, my mother had known immediately what was about to happen. She'd recognized the theatrical hand on the stomach, the trembling voice that was just slightly too rehearsed, the way Danielle positioned herself for maximum visibility and impact. And she'd responded with the kind of surgical precision that came from having spent 3 months investigating and preparing for exactly this scenario. Learning all of this over the course of several Sunday dinners left me with complicated feelings about my mother's methods. On one hand, her investigation and preparation had protected me from having Danielle's lies damage my marriage irreparably. On the other hand, the extent of her surveillance and manipulation felt invasive and controlling in ways that made me uncomfortable. She'd orchestrated Danielle's participation in a fake medical study, used her legal connections to access information that existed in ethical gray areas, and kept the entire investigation secret even from the people most affected by the outcome. Marcus had his own complicated feelings, particularly about my mother's recruitment of Tyler as an informant. His brother's betrayal was devastating enough without adding the layer of Tyler being coerced into cooperation through threats to his career and reputation. We spent hours discussing whether the ends justified the means, whether protecting us from Danielle's scheme gave my mother the right to conduct such an extensive covert operation against her own daughter. My father's perspective, when he finally shared it during a particularly honest conversation in June, was that my mother had done what she always did when protecting her family. She'd assessed the threat, gathered intelligence, and neutralized the danger with maximum efficiency and minimal collateral damage. He didn't necessarily approve of every specific tactic, but he understood her motivations and ultimately supported her actions because the alternative would have been allowing Danielle to potentially destroy multiple lives with her lies. The question of what to do about Danielle herself remained unresolved. She'd moved to Tampa and was apparently working at a hotel doing event coordination. She'd blocked all of our numbers and social media accounts, cutting herself off from the family completely. My mother received occasional updates from a cousin who lived in the Tampa area and had run into Danielle at a grocery store, confirming she was still pregnant and seemingly healthy but unwilling to discuss anything related to her family or the wedding incident. Part of me wanted to reach out, to try to understand what had driven my sister to such extreme actions. We'd never been particularly close, but we'd also never been openly antagonistic until she decided to destroy my wedding. Had she really hated me so much that she'd been willing to fabricate such destructive lies? Or had she been so consumed by jealousy and a sense of being overlooked that she'd lost perspective on appropriate boundaries and behavior? Lauren's advice, delivered over coffee at a waterfront cafe in July, was to let Danielle go for now. That baby was my niece regardless of how she'd been conceived or what her mother had done, and the idea of her growing up without knowing her extended family felt tragic in ways that had nothing to do with adult grievances and everything to do with an innocent child paying for choices she hadn't made. Marcus found me sitting on our balcony that evening staring at my phone, where I'd pulled up the single photo our cousin had sent showing a tiny infant with a surprising amount of dark hair and features that looked more like Tyler than Danielle. He settled into the chair beside me and took my hand without saying anything, understanding that I needed time to process my feelings before trying to articulate them. "I keep thinking about all the family events she'll miss," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "First birthdays and holidays and school plays. All because her mother decided that destroying my wedding was more important than maintaining relationships with her own family." Marcus squeezed my hand gently. "You could reach out if you wanted to. Send a gift or a card. Acknowledge that you're aware of the baby's existence even if you're not ready to reconcile with Danielle herself." The suggestion sat uncomfortably in my chest. Reaching out felt like extending an olive branch that Danielle didn't deserve and might interpret as weakness or forgiveness that hadn't been earned. But ignoring the baby's existence felt equally wrong, like punishing an infant for her mother's sins. I spent the next several days wrestling with the decision, discussing it with Lauren over lunch and with my mother during one of our Sunday dinners. Lauren's position was characteristically direct. She believed that I had no obligation to make any gesture toward Danielle or the baby, that establishing boundaries with toxic family members was healthy and necessary, and that any outreach would likely only complicate an already difficult situation. My mother's perspective was more nuanced, suggesting that sending a small gift with a card acknowledging the baby's birth would allow me to take the high road without committing to ongoing involvement or reconciliation. I ultimately decided to follow my mother's advice, ordering a handmade baby quilt from a local artisan and including a card that read simply, "Congratulations on your daughter's arrival. Wishing you both health and happiness." I signed it with just my first name, keeping the message brief and neutral enough to avoid seeming either vindictive or desperate for reconciliation. The package was sent through our Tampa cousin to avoid revealing my current address to Danielle, a precaution that felt necessary given her track record of dramatic confrontations. The response came 3 weeks later in the form of a letter forwarded through the same cousin. Danielle's handwriting looked shakier than I remembered, the letters uneven and occasionally smudged as if she'd been crying while writing. The message itself was brief but surprisingly raw in its honesty. She acknowledged that she'd made terrible choices driven by jealousy and resentment that had been building for years. She admitted that seeing me succeed at things she struggled with, seeing our parents' pride in my accomplishments and relationship, had eaten away at her sense of self-worth until she'd convinced herself that destroying my happiness was justified. The letter didn't ask for forgiveness or suggest she expected reconciliation. Instead, it focused on accepting responsibility for the damage she'd caused and explaining that she'd named her daughter Claire after our maternal grandmother, hoping that perhaps someday the baby might be able to know the family she'd been born into. Danielle wrote that she was working with a therapist to address the patterns of behavior that had led her to such destructive actions, that she recognized she had significant psychological work to do before she could be a healthy parent or family member. Reading the letter left me emotionally exhausted in ways I hadn't anticipated. Part of me wanted to dismiss it as manipulation, another performance designed to generate sympathy and avoid accountability. But the tone felt genuinely different from Danielle's usual dramatic flair, more subdued and reflective than I'd ever heard from her. Marcus read it after I handed it to him without comment, his expression thoughtful as he processed her words. "What do you want to do?" he asked, folding the letter carefully and placing it on our coffee table. "This doesn't obligate you to anything, but it does seem like maybe she's starting to understand the impact of what she did." I picked up the letter again, studying my sister's handwriting and trying to discern genuine remorse from practiced performance. The truth was I didn't know what I wanted beyond the certainty that I wasn't ready for active reconciliation or regular contact. Perhaps someday we might rebuild some minimal relationship, but that felt years away rather than months. For now, acknowledging her attempt at accountability without committing to more seemed appropriate. I sent another brief note through our cousin, thanking Danielle for her honesty and wishing her well in her therapy work, but making clear that I needed continued distance to focus on my own healing and marriage. I expressed hope that someday Claire might be able to know her extended family, but emphasized that would require Danielle demonstrating sustained change rather than momentary remorse. The boundaries felt necessary even if they also felt harsh, protecting the life Marcus and I were building from potential disruption while leaving the door open for possible future connection. The situation with Tyler proved even more complicated to navigate. Helen Brennan called Marcus in October asking if he'd be willing to meet with his brother, explaining that Tyler had been in intensive therapy for 6 months and his counselor believed that making amends with family members he'd harmed would be an important step in his recovery. Marcus's initial response was an immediate refusal, his anger toward Tyler still too fresh and raw to consider any kind of reconciliation meeting. But Helen persisted gently over several weeks, never pressuring but occasionally mentioning how much Tyler regretted his actions and how seriously he was taking the therapeutic work of understanding why he'd participated in Danielle's scheme. She shared that Tyler had broken down crying when he'd first held Claire through supervised visitation, overwhelmed by the reality that his choices had brought an innocent child into such messy circumstances. He'd committed to regular child support payments and was trying to establish a relationship with his daughter despite Danielle's understandable ambivalence about co-parenting with someone who'd betrayed his own brother. Marcus struggled visibly with the decision of whether to agree to meet with Tyler. I watched him wrestle with competing impulses, the desire to maintain his righteous anger versus the pull of familial bonds and the example his parents had set throughout his life about the importance of forgiveness. He called Ryan multiple times to discuss it, and his best man's advice was pragmatic, pointing out that meeting with Tyler didn't require forgiving him or restoring their previous relationship, but simply creating space to hear what his brother had to say and potentially gain closure on a painful chapter. The meeting finally took place in mid-November at a neutral location, a coffee shop in Columbia halfway between Charleston and Atlanta. Marcus asked me to come with him for support, and I'd agreed despite my own complicated feelings about Tyler. We arrived early and claimed a corner booth with good visibility of the entrance, both of us anxious about how the conversation would unfold. Tyler appeared exactly on time, looking noticeably different from the last time I'd seen him at our wedding. He'd lost weight and gained a gauntness around his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and sustained stress. His usual confident swagger was completely absent, replaced by hunched shoulders and a hesitant approach that made him seem younger and more vulnerable than his 30 years. He slid into the booth across from us and immediately began apologizing, words tumbling out in a rush that suggested he'd rehearsed this speech many times but was now forgetting half of what he'd planned to say. Marcus held up a hand to stop the flood of words. I agreed to meet with you because Mom asked me to, not because I've forgiven you or because I'm ready to pretend everything is fine between us. If you want me to hear what you have to say, you need to slow down and speak clearly rather than just vomiting out apologies. Tyler took a shaky breath and nodded, clearly fighting for composure. He started over more slowly, explaining the resentment he'd harbored toward Marcus for years, feeling perpetually overshadowed and comparing himself unfavorably to his older brother's achievements and relationships. He described how Danielle had tapped into that resentment, making him feel seen and understood in ways he hadn't experienced before, convincing him that Marcus had gotten everything easily while Tyler had to struggle for recognition. The explanation wasn't an excuse, and to Tyler's credit he made that clear repeatedly. He took full responsibility for his choices to participate in Danielle's scheme, acknowledging that his resentment didn't justify betraying his brother or participating in an attempt to destroy Marcus's relationship and reputation. He described the shame he felt when my mother had confronted him in Atlanta, the relief of finally being forced to face the consequences of his actions rather than continuing to live with the secret. Tyler talked about his initial meetings with Claire, the shock of realizing he'd become a father through such destructive circumstances, and the commitment he'd made to be present in her life despite the complicated dynamics with Danielle. He'd been attending therapy twice weekly, working on understanding the patterns of behavior and thought that had made him vulnerable to participating in such a harmful scheme. He'd also been working to repair his relationship with their parents, though Helen and her husband were still processing their disappointment and working toward forgiveness. Marcus listened to all of this with an expression I couldn't fully read, his face carefully neutral as Tyler spoke. When his brother finally finished and sat waiting for some response, Marcus remained quiet for what felt like several minutes, clearly thinking through what he wanted to say. "I appreciate you taking responsibility," Marcus said finally, his voice measured and controlled. "And I'm glad you're working with a therapist to address whatever drove you to make such terrible choices. But I need you to understand that hearing your explanation doesn't erase what you did. You participated in a plan to destroy my marriage before it even started. You were willing to let me be falsely accused of getting my fiancé's sister pregnant. You helped create a situation where Victoria was publicly humiliated at what should have been one of the happiest days of her life." Tyler's face crumpled at this recitation of his actions, tears streaming down his cheeks in a way that looked genuinely anguished rather than manipulative. "I know," he whispered. "I know I can't undo any of it. I just wanted you to hear that I'm sorry and that I'm trying to become someone who would never do something like that again." Marcus nodded slowly. "I hear that you're sorry. And maybe someday I'll be able to forgive you enough that we can have some kind of relationship again. But that day isn't today, and I can't promise when or if it will come. For now, the best thing you can do is focus on being a good father to Claire and continuing whatever work you need to do to become a better person. Stop worrying about whether I'll ever trust you again and start working on becoming someone who deserves trust." The conversation lasted another 20 minutes as Tyler asked a few questions about what kind of relationship might be possible in the future and Marcus remained honestly uncertain. They didn't hug when the meeting ended, didn't make promises about staying in touch or seeing each other again soon. Tyler simply thanked us both for agreeing to meet with him, then left the coffee shop with his shoulders still hunched and his movements still tentative. Marcus was quiet during the drive back to Charleston, processing the encounter and his own complicated feelings about it. I didn't push him to talk, understanding that he needed space to work through his emotions. It wasn't until we were nearly home that he finally spoke, his voice rough with suppressed feeling. "I hate that part of me still cares about him," Marcus admitted. "It would be so much easier if I could just write him off completely and never think about him again. But he's still my brother, and some part of me wants to believe that people can change and grow from their mistakes." I reached over to squeeze his hand, offering silent support for whatever he decided about his relationship with Tyler. The situation had no easy answers, no clear path forward that would satisfy everyone's needs for justice and healing simultaneously. All we could do was navigate it as honestly as possible while protecting the marriage we'd fought to preserve. The Children's Hospital Gala in November exceeded all fundraising expectations, bringing in nearly $2 million for pediatric cancer research and treatment programs. Standing at the podium delivering my closing remarks, thanking donors and volunteers who'd made the evening possible, I felt a sense of accomplishment that had nothing to do with my personal drama and everything to do with work that genuinely mattered. Marcus sat at our table looking proud, and when I returned to my seat he kissed my temple and whispered that watching me coordinate such a meaningful event reminded him why he'd fallen in love with me in the first place. December brought the holidays and decisions about how to navigate family gatherings given the fractured relationships that defined both our families now. Helen Brennan extended an invitation for Christmas dinner that explicitly included only Marcus and me, a tactful acknowledgement that having Tyler present would create unbearable tension. My parents' celebration would similarly exclude Danielle, though my mother had arranged to have gifts sent to Tampa for Claire, maintaining connection with her granddaughter even while boundaries remained firmly in place with her younger daughter. The day after Christmas, Lauren and I met for our annual tradition of post-holiday brunch and gift exchange. She handed me a beautifully wrapped package that contained a leather-bound journal with my initials embossed on the cover. Inside the front cover she'd written a note encouraging me to document this year's experiences, not as a way of dwelling on pain but as a method of processing everything that had happened and recognizing my own growth through it. I spent New Year's Eve writing the first entry, sitting on our balcony wrapped in blankets while Marcus slept inside and fireworks occasionally lit up the sky over the harbor. I wrote about the shock of Danielle's accusation, the relief of my mother's intervention, the complicated grief of losing a sister I'd never been particularly close to but had always assumed would be part of my life. I wrote about discovering reserves of strength I hadn't known I possessed, about learning that survival sometimes looked like simply continuing forward when everything felt impossible. Spring arrived with azaleas blooming throughout Charleston and a sense that perhaps the worst of our family crisis had passed. Danielle sent occasional updates through our cousin, photos of Claire reaching various milestones and brief notes about her own continued therapy work. I responded with equal brevity, maintaining minimal contact that acknowledged our connection without demanding more emotional investment than I could sustainably provide. Tyler had apparently moved to Tampa to be closer to his daughter, taking a position with a pharmaceutical company there and working to establish consistent co-parenting with Danielle despite their complicated history. Marcus and I celebrated our first anniversary with a weekend trip to Savannah, deliberately choosing a destination close enough that we wouldn't miss work but far enough to feel like an escape. We walked through historic squares and ate seafood at restaurants overlooking the river, talking about the year we'd survived and the future we were building. The conversation eventually turned to whether we wanted children of our own, a topic we'd avoided since the wedding disaster but that felt ready for discussion now. Neither of us felt urgency about the decision, content to let it unfold naturally rather than forcing a timeline. But there was something healing about being able to discuss potential future children without the conversation being overshadowed by Danielle's false accusations or Tyler's actual daughter. We could imagine our own path forward independent of the chaos others had created, defining our family on our own terms rather than in reaction to anyone else's choices. My mother's role in everything remained complicated in my mind, but I'd come to appreciate the fierce protectiveness that had driven her investigation even while remaining uncomfortable with some of her methods. During one of our Sunday dinners in June, she'd acknowledged that perhaps she'd overstepped in certain ways, that her need to control and protect had sometimes manifested as invasion rather than support. The admission surprised me coming from a woman who rarely questioned her own decisions, and it opened space for more honest conversations about boundaries and trust. By the time our second wedding anniversary approached, life had settled into rhythms that felt sustainable and genuine. The scandal that had defined our wedding had faded into Charleston society's collective memory, occasionally referenced but no longer the primary story people told about us. We'd become simply Marcus and Victoria Brennan, a couple navigating marriage with the same mixture of joy and challenge that characterized most relationships, distinguished mainly by having faced our biggest test unusually early. Standing on our balcony on a warm May evening, watching boats drift past on the river while Marcus grilled dinner, I realized I'd stopped waiting for the next crisis to emerge. The hypervigilance that had defined the months after our wedding had gradually released its grip, replaced by cautious optimism that perhaps we'd actually weathered the worst and come through stronger for it. Whatever challenges lay ahead would be met together, with the confidence that came from having already survived what should have destroyed us. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.